Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm in Connecticut. My name is Shaukat Turawa. I'm one of the executive editors of the Library of Arabic Literature. And on behalf of Philip Kennedy, who is the general editor, and on behalf of the library and the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's annual Library of Arabic Literature lecture. This is something that we usually hold in person, live in Abu Dhabi, at the same time as our annual board meeting. This is something that we've been doing now for, I guess, 10 or this would be the 11th year. Typically, we ask one of our editors, that is, the members of our editorial board, to speak about a project they're working on for the library. The Library of Arabic Literature is a series that produces authoritative editions of Arabic texts that are significant to the heritage. Here's one in dual-facing translations, Arabic on one side, English on the other. We then extract the English and produce English paperbacks. This first text I showed you just came out, is the Book of Charlatans by Al-Jawbari. The second book in paperback that I just held up is the poetry of Abdullah ibn Subayl. And we have certain other products, as it were. The Arabic is freely available from the website, downloadable. We also sometimes produce scholarly editions. But the bulk of the work is to produce these facing English Arabic translations for posterity. The editors over the past few years who've spoken, or the individuals who've given the annual lecture, in 2018, it was Bilal Orf Ali from the American University of Beirut, who gave a talk called Walking in the Steps of Poets, Courtly Themes in Early Sufism. Last year, Huda Fakhreddin of the University of Pennsylvania spoke on Arabic poetry in the 21st century, translation and multilingualism. These are now members of our editorial board, and one of the things we asked them to do is speak about their own work. That is to say, we expanded the purview of the annual lectures to include material that the editors were working on themselves, whether or not they were that work was related to the Library of Arabic Literature. This year, we have the good fortune and pleasure of listening to Enass Khansa, also of the American University of Beirut, and also newly on our board. We reconstituted the board this year for the 11th through 15th year of the project. This project is funded by Tamkeen through the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. We're eternally grateful for the support that we receive, both financially, but also institutionally. And at the end of the talk, I'll acknowledge folks more specifically. So Enass is a new board member and has decided to speak on the Arabian Nights. We hope that you enjoy the talk. I will just tell you a little bit about her before I ask her to begin. She has a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Georgetown University. She worked on the Aqd al-Farid by Ibn Abd al-Rabbih. She has held a Mellon Fellowship with UNESCO's Santiago de Compostela Conservation Project through Harvard University, and she was a fellow of the Aga Khan Program for the History of Islamic Art and Architecture at Harvard. As I said, she's now based at the American University of Beirut. I should just mention that a number of our new editors are based at universities in the Arabic-speaking world, and a number of them are based in the US. So Enass and the aforementioned Bilal Orf Ali and Huda Fakhreddin are joined by Lara Harb from Princeton University, Maya Kasrawani and Morris Pomerantz, both of NYU Abu Dhabi, Mohammed Rostam of Carleton University, and Sean Anthony of Ohio State as the new board. As I said, we asked them, and we will continue to ask them to present their work to the larger public, to the public. Enass, I ask you now to present. It's a webinar. It's a bit weird. I gather I'll be blanked out. Everyone will be able to hear you, and the audience will be able to ask questions by posting to the chat. And Nahid and I will probably be sending you messages in the chat, that is the audience, to help guide you. To use a true and tried expression, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Enass Khansa of the Library of Arabic Literature.
Thank you, Dr. Turawa. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy and Bilal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. In this talk, I make audible a conversation in the 1001 Nights, Alf Layla from here onwards, on the meaning and application of justice. More specifically, I analyze 3 sequences of stories: the 2 kings with 1 incest stories, the merchant and the jinni, the 3 incest stories, and the fisherman and the afreet, the 7, 5, or 1 incest story, depending on the manuscripts. All 3 understood to belong to the earliest bundle. Without assuming that Alf Layla constitutes an organized whole or that one story can represent the work, I uncover how the stories speak to one another, primarily through adapting synonymous punitive premises to changing context and through exploring the meaning of justice. So I make 3 arguments based on this analysis. First, that Alf Layla adopts an attitude that advocates for multiplicity over singular interpretation in a fashion that confirms the contingency of ethical questions. Second, that Alf Layla equates poor rulership with a failure of interpretation and locates the solution to both in a communal framework. And lastly, that Alf Layla, in theme, presentation, and designation, subscribes to Arabo-Islamic styles of knowledge production. Oops. Let's see. Sorry, started as it's the end. Okay. I choose to start with this piece by Yasmin Seal, scholar translator now of the Arabian Nights, to recognize from the onset that the politics of our position as readers of medieval literature. It's one of privilege and power. We do not bring medieval works to life when we read them. We are creating them anew with every interpretation. So today, my reading is one of many, and I hope you find it interesting. Alf Layla comes to us from different surviving fragments. The slide here is the famous Chicago fragment that Nabia Abad uncovered in her article, where it brought us a confirmation that Alf Layla was not just a title in Ibn Nadim's Fihris, but an actual work. Abad's colleague at Chicago, who later moved to Harvard, Mohsen Mahdi, spent 25 years meticulously reconstructing Alf Layla from the earliest sources available to us, the Syrian family of manuscripts and the slightly later Egyptian family of manuscripts. The research into the history of the manuscripts has not stopped, but his work that was published in 3 volumes in 1984 to 1994 remains authoritative. And it's what I consult in this study. I supplemented when needed from other sources. So today I will be speaking about the stories in details, how they provoke a conversation on justice, and we'll be then speaking about the affinity with advice literature, and lastly, how I see Alf Layla as a work of Adam. The nonlinear genetic histories of Alf Layla complicate any discussion of the threads that connect the frame tale to the body of stories that are independent yet entangled with one another. Scholarly discussions tend to assume a divide and often privilege the opening story as a stem from which the rest of the work branches. And I believe this divide, this assumed divide, contributed to overlooking important aspects in Alf Layla. The overwhelming focus in the scholarship examines structure, like storytelling, themes, like storytelling as ransom for life, and motives, adultery with slaves, magic, and the appearance of jinn, desire, as the elements that suture the stories together, which again inhibited attention to how the stories speak to one another, which is what I hope to be doing today. I would like to argue that what connects the stories with one another should be understood as an opportunity for examining the work's engagement with its Arabo-Islamic context. To that end, I will show today that the 2 kings, which is known as the frame tale, and the 2 following sequences of stories seem to have been rewoven into an extended debate over the meaning and application of justice. A striking feature the study of Alf Layla should recognize lies in how its modern and Western inception, both as a text as an intrigue, curtailed the attention to Arabo-Islamic character encouraging layers of narrative in different contexts that made strange and in need of proving any reverberations of medieval Arabo-Islamic questions, values, and attitudes. And here lies the contribution of this study. In what has been read as fate, arbitrary logic, enchantment, magic, and dreamlike narratives, I suggest we can equally speak of a concern for justice, not only as a theme, but as a heuristic designation as well. The popularity of Alf Layla and afterlives it enjoyed up to our present times in the Arab world and the West, in cross-cultural incarnations and translations, need not eclipse or substitute the Arabo-Islamic character the work came to adopt and the questions it set out to address. What then connects these stories in Alf Layla? Here I want to revisit the analysis and the scholarship. Fairy tales are not unique to Alf Layla, Arabo-Islamic culture, or medieval times. They have been studied in a variety of contexts where scholars ask how the frame informs the embedded sequences, and the opposite, how the embedded stories shed light on the frame tale. Frame tales have been considered parasitical in need of embedded tales to survive. They have been understood through oral written transmission and through their ability to carry tales over time. They more recently, in the works of David Wax, have been examined as sites for cultural and intercultural encounters. Of Alf Layla in particular, the frame narrative has been studied through multiple frameworks. And here I list a few. Farial Ghazul understands the frame tale as a necklace and considers the embedded stories as beats. The first, she argues, can stand on its own, the latter cannot. Mohsen al-Musawi suggests we think of the burgeoning and traveling of a frame tale into a metropolitan culture of great urban power. Mohsen Mahdi, who edited the authoritative text of Alf Layla, suggests that tales cannot be understood to be put randomly. He speaks of design and the writing, compiling, and copying of these tales. Of course, he has a critique of certain practices in these processes. Abu Bakr Shiraibi considers the order, especially of the first sequence, to be a scholarly intervention. And lastly, Carla Mallet, in a recent piece, speaks of how the frame tale gives us a hermeneutic map of the work. To these, particularly in the spirit of the last three, I would like to add a reading inspired by the analysis of these stories. I suggest we read the framing embedding dynamic differently, by suspending the assumption of divide between the frame and body of stories, and by focusing on the epistemic conversation that connects the two. The crisis in the frame tale raises a question about kingly power. The following two sequences respond in two connected yet distinct threads. So what I'm proposing, instead of interdependence or the hierarchical view that most theories uphold, is to think of a correspondence. We can look at these stories as equal components of one debate. Alf Layla, I believe, subscribes to Arabo-Islamic medieval writing, which is marked by diegetic fluidity, by which I mean the style of presenting akhbar and pieces of information in medieval Arab works. In debating a particular point, medieval authors cohere reports, poetry lines, quotations, and examples, often from distinct genres, from a wide variety of sources, Greek, Sasanian, Indian, and Jahili, a feature that has been characterized as a humanist worldview. How these different quotes are presented is what I'm particularly interested in here. The fact that the pieces can be placed next to each other and assume a conversation or some form of continuity is quite unique to medieval writing, and it exhibits flexibility in moving from one world, or one narrative, one diegetic world to another. To go back then, epistemic continuity across layering is the most unique feature of Arabic writing we see in Alf Layla. And it's one that gestures to greater engagement with readership. Now on to the stories. Alf Layla opens with the story of the two kings, King Shahriyar and Shah Zaman, referred to as the frame narrative. We first are introduced to King Shahryar as a successful ruler with a stable kingdom. His people were loyal to him. He went hunting, which is another marker of stability. You don't go hunting when the country is at crisis. But also we are shown an extended period of time, 10 years, during which King Shahryar and King Shah Zaman, his brother, ruled peacefully. Quickly, however, the fairy tale introduces a breach of absolute power when an affair the queen and the maids of the palace have, without the permission or knowledge of the king, is discovered and witnessed. In response, the king embarks on a journey to disavow kingly power, but fails on this trip and returns to address the initial challenge by reasserting his authority. He starts marrying a woman every night and orders them to be killed by dawn, the execution being carried out literally by his vizier. A crisis ensues. From the Palatine side, chaos spreads kingdom-wide. The first 3 executed brides, the daughter of the vizier, an army general, and a merchant, are then followed by daughters of the mercantile circle and the commoners, من أولاد التجار وبنات العامة. Dissatisfaction plagues the kingdom as a whole, gesturing to the interdependence of sound kingly administration and the stability of the state, and thus priming the reader and the listener from the onset to expect the solution to be found within a communal framework that speaks to both. The king's practice brings about the interference of the vizier's daughter, Shahrazad, who marries the king and delays her own execution by narrating stories until an heir is produced, marking a resolution to the crisis and a conclusion to the next.
Enass, may I just interrupt 1 second? The Q&A, people are saying that it's not loud enough and it's not clear. I think you may need to move closer to your mic. And also, I think when you raise your papers, I think it is blocking voice from the mic. So you may need to I think the easiest thing is simply just to raise your voice.
Okay.
To be a bit louder, yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I sent you a message, but there's been a number of people commenting on that they're having difficulty hearing. One of the liabilities of the web, of course.
Thank
and
you.
I apologize to the audience for interrupting as well, but this was on your behalf. All right, go ahead.
Okay, interrupt me again if it doesn't get better, but I will try to raise my voice. Okay.
Great.
There should be an agreement that King Shahryar's decision constitutes a form of injustice. The theme of women's deceit, however, has been identified as the primary designation of the crisis. And as such, the interpretation of the work tended to prioritize punishment and power as the guiding project of Layla. While the question of women's deceit weaves into the chain of events that lead to the king's decision and reappear in later tales, prioritizing it as the main line of inquiry, this embeds the story from a more organically developed concern pertaining to good rulership and the question of justice. The adultery scene itself should be understood as a breach of royal authority. The crisis then is not about adultery, but about authority. And the injustice the opening tale presents pertains to the abuse of kingly power, which Alf Layla openly equates with a failure of interpretation. In witnessing seemingly synonymous instances of women's deceit, the character of King Shahryar mistakes repetition for evidence, and the conclusion that women cannot be faithful or trusted is reached independent of advisors, precedent, and context. Following this act of flawed reasoning, the king collapses 3 positions by simultaneously assuming the role of a witness, a victim, and a judge. Is it better? I hope everyone can hear me better now.
It is better.
Thank you. Not being a party in a dispute while adjudicating is an intuitive rule. A cultural cue from a poetry shows how the collapse of the 2 positions into one, meaning being a party and a judge in the same dispute, has been identified as a marker of injustice, and that king's exemption of this violation was widely recognized and generally accepted. In attempting to remedy an impossible political situation, the famed Arab poet, Mutanabbi, laments the disruption of his friendship with his patron, Hamdani Amir Saif al-Dawla, who later expelled him from his majlis. To highlight the injustice of the fallout, Al-Mutanabbi writes, يا أعدل الناس إلا في معاملتي فيك الخصام وأنت الخصم والحكم. O you, most just of all people, except in how you treat me, the dispute is with you, and you are both the opponent and the decider. The line echoes an expression to the same effect from a poem by an earlier poet, in which he writes, ولست أرجو انتصافا منك ما ذرفت عيني دموعا وأنت الخصم والحكم. And I do not expect justice on your hands as long as my eye sheds tears and as long as you are both the opponent, al-khasm, and the decider, al-hakam. As for being a witness while adjudicating, classical Islamic sources confirm the intuitive ethos on this front as well. In the story of Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was approached by two people to rule on a dispute and was asked by one of them to be a witness. He refuses and says, I either do one or the other. إن شئتما شهدت ولم أحكم أو أحكم ولا أشهد. In both legal and popular understanding, the conflation of positions marks an interruption of justice, and thus would have been quite clear to the readers of Alf Layla. The problematic Alf Layla is provoking in the frame tale, then, produces an opportunity to revisit the king's exemption from these rules. In other words, Alf Layla is questioning whether the ruler can be above the law, and seems to be asking, shouldn't the king subscribe to recognized norms and perform accordingly to secure a just conclusion and thus stability and communal good? And it is this claim, I believe, the following two sequences of stories address. On the first night of Alf Layla, with a request from her sister, Shahrazad starts narrating the story of the merchant and the jinn, which opens with a scene of a crime. The merchant unknowingly kills the son of a jinni by throwing the pit of a date in the forest and is now threatened to be killed by the jinni. The merchant asks, why would he kill me? بأي ذنب تقتلني? And the jinni explains. The merchant protests and asks for pardon, but the jinni insists, I must kill you for killing my son. أوليس القتل بالقتل. The merchant requests and is granted a grace period to settle his accounts and inform his family. A year later, he returns to the rendezvous point and waits. When a sheikh passes by, accompanied by a gazelle and chains, then another accompanied by two black dogs, and a third with a she-mule. Hearing the story of the merchant, all three of them feel the obligation to stay and help. So they wait for the jinni with whom they strike a deal. Each would volunteer to redeem 1/3 of the merchant's life by telling appealing stories, ajiba, on the condition that they please the jinni. The stories please the jinni, and the merchant is pardoned and returned, reunited with his family. Abu Bakr al-Shiraibi points to how the frame tale in the sequence harkens back to the tale of Khurafa, a Bedouin who is taken by jinnis in the desert. While the captors are uncertain on whether to kill, enslave, or free Khurafa, three people appear and tell an extraordinary story in exchange for his release. The story of Khurafa is quite famous because there is a claim that after surviving, he narrated his experience to the Prophet. And Juri suggests that this was a way to legitimize the genre of Khurafa. In Khurafa, kidnapping has no reason or justification. The moment preceding it is silent. The story as it appears in Alf Layla instead is about transgression, about accountability and clemency. It's also about how stories create an obligation to interfere on behalf of justice. Lastly, it ties the sequence inversely to the frame tale through the conspicuous absence of witnessing. against which the crisis of Shahriyar starts. The main feature I'd like to highlight here about this sequence of stories is the progressive trajectory of the punitive decisions. The story starts with the frame tale where the jinni loses his son and threatens to kill the merchant. So here punishment is commensurate with the transgression. With the story of the first sheikh, we see reduced punishment or a fragment, a taste of the transgression. While the second sheikh, we see conditioned pardon. The third and last story parodies King Shahriyar's story more directly in having a husband witness an adultery and proposes in response to adultery and 2 murders forgiveness. The jinni settles the case in concert with the 3 sheikhs and sets the merchant free. In none, it must be noted, punishment results in death. Against the story of Shahriyar, this sequence engages directly with the crisis of the frame tale. It introduces a series of conversations, majlis-like trials, that transform notions of revenge from punishment to pardon. The stories more urgently tie in an inverse correlation the finality of punishment to the act of reading or listening. By that I mean that interpretation primes the characters, including the jinni, to find confirmation of justice and responses to transgression in the process rather than in the punitive outcomes. The sequence locates fairness in a dialogical collectiveness, asserting that narration is yoked to a concern of justice. The stories narrated by the sheikhs are not only appealing, they're actually autobiographical and they share a theme. They do not simply please the jinni, we would assume. They set up a collage of experiments in each, an individual interpretation produces new iteration that is both specific to its own context, yet communicative of broader shared norms. Through this, Al-Flayla seems to be suggesting to us that interpretation is not only a contribution to the ongoing aspiration for justice, but as a collective process in itself can become a site for clemency. Put differently, clemency unfolds in the dialogical act of interpretation. A second sequence of stories introduced on the 8th night, the story of the fisherman and the Afrit, expands the debate into a new angle and starts with the discussion of ihsan, benevolence. So it resumes where the first sequence ends. The chain introduces the story of King Yunan and sage Juban, in which the sage who cures the ailing king is killed by the king. But the story doesn't end there. In a humorous nudge to the frame tale, the sage asks the king to read a book with such a mysterious title, Khas al-Khawas, after killing him, which the king does, only to realize that the book had blank pages and a deadly poison. The king dies after trying to read the book. The sequence takes the debate further and rejects transgression in favor of pardon and reward. In the frame story, the fisherman, after freeing the Afrit from millennial captivity, finds himself facing death. So this is the famous story of the jinni in a bottle at the bottom of the ocean. And the fisherman, upon freeing him, instead of expecting reward, is threatened to be killed. How can you repay kindness with punishment? He asks. هذا جزائي منك وجزاء ما خلصتك. Rather than evaluating transgression, retribution itself is poised to be examined here as a marker of betrayal and injustice, or the behavior of the wicked, al-fawajir, as the fisherman puts it. A number of inset tales are told before the story concludes with an act of pardon, which in turn is reciprocated by reward. During his captivity, the Afrit, which we mentioned, he was one of the rebel Afrits that revolted against King Solomon. The rebel Afrit in the frame story experiments with scenarios in which he makes pledges to whomever would set him free. During the first 200 years, the Afrit pledges to make the person who sets them free rich until the end of time. In the following 200 years, he promises to reward them with the riches of the world. The following 400 and 100 years, he's still waiting. The Afrit pledges to make them a sultan and to be their servant, making 3 wishes come true every day. After all these centuries, when no one came to the rescue, the Afrit pledges to kill whoever frees them savagely, or alternatively, to let them choose how to die. Armed with boundless might, the Afrit, now restrained by captivity, embarks on a hypothetical exercise of power, within which, through fickle and temporally conditioned pledges, fatal retribution is placed within the epistemic ambit of ultimate reward, thus constituting power in a way that chooses pardon in lieu of punishment becomes possible. And the stories within the sequence of the fisherman and the Afrit realize this range, thus presenting a miniature of the overall plot of Al-Flayla and the king's transformation from punishment to pardon and reward. The frame story and the first 2 sequences constitute one cohesive debate. In questioning punitive notions, the 2 sequences seem to be directly responding to the initial collapse of positions that King Shahriyar exemplified in a display of absolute and unrestrained power. Shahrazad probably did not stop here, but she could have, since a complete tale has been told in these 2 stories. The first sequence enacts a series of short trials that transform Shahriyar's revenge into a spectrum of options, ranging from retaliation to pardon. The second sequence resumes where the first ends, with a story about Ihsan. It takes the debate further and investigates retribution itself. The 2 combined present a progressive trajectory. While the first sequence accepts retribution as a response to transgression, yet favors pardon, the second shows that without attention to context and proper process, retribution itself can become a form of transgression with deadly outcomes. In adopting multiple scenarios for synonymous premises, the 2 combined, like the rebel Afrit, expand the interpretive potentials of retribution against changing contexts. The punitive decision reached by King Shahriyar re-emerges in scenes the stories curate to parody his dilemma. The decision taken by the king alone extends in these 2 chains into a sequence of sessions involving several characters whose configuration to one another produces multiple iterations of justice. Al-Flayla, most significantly in these sequences, suggests that storytelling is geared towards seeking clemency and communal good. I would like now to have a short discussion of the overlap between Al-Flayla and advice literature. I would be happy to expand in the Q&A. It has been suggested that Al-Flayla can be an extended, loose work of advice literature, and I want to address this point. Quoted from 3 different advice works, these suggestions in this slide correspond to themes we can locate in the stories examined here from Al-Flayla of Layla. The overlap, thematic and literal borrowing between Al-Flayla and works of advice literature is undeniable and has been actually proven by scholars. Yet a distinction must be made between advice, advisors, and advice literature in the study of the program of Al-Flayla. And of the 3, I suggest a greater role should be given to advisors, as I see Al-Flayla belonging to a broader adab framework that goes beyond what we encounter in advice literature. Embedded within theological, philosophical, and literary frameworks, advice is quite ubiquitous. It might be nearly impossible to find a work of literature that doesn't entail at least a feature of advice. Advice literature, however, is a specific genre. It addresses questions of communal good, order, and concerns itself with the management of government. Works of advice literature are often written in very particular contexts and addressed to a specific pattern. Despite their wide readership and inclusive cultural geographies, works of advice literature come with very serious and specific missions. We can think, for example, of Al-Mawardi's Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, where he presses the need to defend the caliphate as a Sunni institution. Or Al-Saqalli's Sulwan al-Muta'a, consolation for the ruler during the hostility of the subject, which has empirical advice to the ruler facing unrest among the subjects. Or what we see in Tuhfat al-Turk by Turtusi, wherein he attempts to persuade the Mamluk ruler to give exclusive priority to the Hanafi school of law over other Sunni schools that got somewhat equal official representation at the time. If we claim a congruity between advice literature as a genre and Alf Layla, it's because we can quickly detect features distinctly shared between the two. But do these shared elements suffice to make Alf Layla a work of advice literature, as has been suggested? I would caution against such views since it has limitations. It's important to point to these affinities between the two, but it's equally urgent to ask why and how a work of semi-popular literature is a participant in and a witness to societal conversation on justice and good rulership. It helps us include adab in reconstructing how the Islamic communities understood the realm of justice. By showing how the king loses sight of justice, I go back here to Alf Layla, we are to understand that justice cannot be realized within the person of the king alone. In doing so, Alf Layla makes a strong case for an external management or co-management of rulership. In The Crisis and Its Solutions, we are directed to see that singular interpretation is an act of coercion and a violent form, as we see it in the repeated literal beheadings of innocent women in the Frame Tale. In other words, Alf Layla shows us that justice is a communal enterprise. It's dialogical and it's artificial. And in all three respects, it intertwines emphatically with the act of interpretation that comes to life in its dynamic engagement with precedent, consultation, and context. Advice literature shares a wall with law. Cohesion and the status quo, with few exceptions, guide these works. Alf Layla, loosely communicative of formal legal steps, allows for clemency where law would have asked for a different outcome. In other words, the justice that we see in Alf Layla is distinct from the view we attend to in advice works. The solution in the stories examined here is another point of departure from advice works, where stabilizing strategies of interpretation within a clear order that protects the centrality of the political rule takes priority. Alf Layla instead leans heavier on the reader audience, and the process of generating clemency emerges as a collective, adaptable, and therefore promissory. And perhaps in this last feature, despite taking on new meaning in its many incarnations, Alf Layla lays claim to its undying appeal. In these points, I read a call for advisors, for a majlis, and for the ruler to be aware of the cultural context in the broader sense of the word. In Alf Layla, the king's attempt to bring meaning to a closure, to a finality that is sealed and confirmed by blood, dismantles itself against multiplicity, which protects reading as a discursive practice and suggests to us that rulership is a performance that comes to life through consultation. This is why I would suggest we read Alf Layla as a work of adab. It belongs to Islamic culture in that the act of reading has been construed within hermeneutics that are largely informed and conditioned by and even contingent on the ethical implication sharing knowledge entails. Just as the jinni who forgives once informed of other experiences narrated to him by the three sheikhs, and the ifrit who becomes capable of choosing ihsan in lieu of random punishment, the king is reformed, and the stability of the kingdom is restored through the knowledge that Shahrazad shared throughout the nights. Sharing knowledge as narration, as advice, as storytelling is geared towards a concern for the greater good, Al-Flayla seems to be suggesting, and it's a claim that lies at the heart of Adam. To conclude, the popularity of Al-Flayla is quite astounding. Here I wanted to share in this slide a very exciting survey of the number of books and PhD and master's projects that decided, that chose Al-Flayla as a theme, and it's ongoing and it keeps growing. It's quite exciting. We should be thrilled to see a game named after Al-Flayla, or a new ballet adaptation on magic and seduction. But to look at hundreds of Arab works from medieval culture suggests to us something different. If we look at Ibn Qutayba, writing in the 9th century in Baghdad, who speaks of sharing knowledge as a societal obligation, he tells us, Zakatul ilmi nashruhu. Or Ibn Abd Rabbih, who speaks also of vocation to share knowledge. Or Ibn Bassam, who speaks of grace and virtue entailed in writing his anthology, Al-Zakhira. And lastly, As-Safadi, who speaks of inclusivity. His work is open to everyone, and this beautiful expression. He said, I invited to this book Al-Jafala, meaning without any discrimination, everyone is welcome to read this work. These works tell us that Arabo-Islamic medieval societies understood the profound obligation to advancing human connection through sharing knowledge. And it's here that I believe we can locate Al-Flayla's claim, namely that interpretation presses us to a greater concern for justice. Thank you. I'll stop sharing and I'll glance at the questions and start answering. Please add as many questions as you like.
Enass, are you going to field the questions or shall I?
I'm going to look at them. The first one from Amira, she's asking, she's saying that at school they were taught that most stories are Persian and that the Arabs are the one who are able to keep it. I go back to my first slide with Yasmin's work. Actually, Al-Flayla is not unique, but a great work to look at these cultural journeys from Persian and Indian sources to Arabic medieval sources to European and the rest of the world. So it's a traveling text, and yes, it's understood to have an Eastern origin. But as I show in the slide of the fragment, actually the frame tale that I talk about in this presentation that Mohsen Mahdi reconstructed from the earliest manuscripts is not in that fragment. So we know in the 9th century we had a different version of the Nile. So it's kept changing, and it's still changing actually until today. Another question from Mustafa, is the meaning and definition of justice in the stories clear? Is it something to take for granted? I hope to have shown that it's a primary concern in these 3 sets of stories. But it's a definition. This is a work of literature, so it's not given us a definition as we would expect in other forms of knowledge. It's kind of reworking the meaning of clemency and of interpretation. And in the story of the king, of course, being reformed, it's dealing with justice and rulership. this question about President Trump. The question that if the ruler can be above the law, yes, we can read what's happening today.
I interrupt here and say that as a moderator, that the question is not appropriate for this forum. Okay. And although I'm sure that maybe this person can contact you privately and ask you.
Yeah, please. Any questions beyond this session, you're welcome to send me like a message or an email. What do you think of those who read the 1001 Nights as a good resource or representation of the Islamic and the Arab world? From Ghazal. I think it's one work of many, and it's very complex and very rich work, and it continues, as I pointed out, to generate interest and discussion, and it's a good thing. But I believe we should not take one work from any culture to be a representative of the culture. It's a work of literature, and there are many other medieval texts that speak of different aspects of Islamic culture. So okay. It says here, is it fair to say that the emphasis on advice in the Arabian Nights is a clear trait of Arabian tribal traditions? I'm not quite sure what that is in reference to, but I think the idea, are you referring to Shura maybe? It could be, in the sense that it's not going back to one specific tradition, but as I pointed out, advice and the recommendation for consultation runs through many forms of knowledge in Arabic medieval culture, specifically when it comes to law and to political rulership. I think that's. Thank you for all the.
There's a comment about comments that you showed statistics about studies of Alf Layla in the Arab world. Were those statistics from the Arab world, or was that worldwide?
No. This is. Let me go back. I don't know if you can see the screen stuff. It's from the Arab world, and it doesn't go into details. The study is by Ibrahim Aqil from 2016. It's one of the books edited by Shiraibi. It goes into the numbers of books, chapters, and PhD and master's work on Alf Layla from the Arab world. And you see the first one started in 1941. And it keeps growing in the last 15 years, or from 2000 to 2015, it's almost 300 works. So it keeps growing, which is quite...
If I could just add for this questioner, so even though it's now a little bit out of date, maybe 10 years, there's something called the Encyclopedia of the Arabian Nights, which I believe is now available freely online. And that is a huge repository of information about all the work that's been undertaken, at least until the point that it came out. And it'll include answers to your question about how many works have been, how many languages have been translated into, and so on. I'm sure you know this work well.
Yes. It's an incredible resource for anything related to Alf Layla. But yeah, new studies keep coming out, which is quite exciting. So. Okay. Please share your email. Yes, I will share my email in the chat. Can I do that in the chat?
There's a question that's come in from Muhammad Rustam. It says, I noticed that there were resonances of the text in Ibn Tufail's Hayy ibn Yaqzan that leads me to wonder how pervasive the influence of this work has been on the Arabic Islamic tradition in terms of a variety of genres. We are told often that the influence is extensive Are there any other specific examples of its adaptation in the tradition?
I think, thank you, Mohammed, for the question. I think part of my interest in writing about this concern for justice in Alf Layla is to bring Alf Layla into more circles of discussion about the influence in other works, medieval works. And that's why I suggest we do not call it a work of advice literature. It's a work of literature that's trying to rework these concepts. So my hope is that it would be included more in discussions of justice and communal good, which so far hasn't been done. There are many studies about Alf Layla in other areas, but not when it comes to particularly to conception of justice.
There's a question from Nora. Hello, nice to hear from you. Just wanted to ask about the role of women in justice in these stories, but specifically in relation to Shahrazad.
I thank you for this because there is one slide that I didn't share that I would like to share, and it's this one. As I said at the beginning, this is one reading of many, and Alf Layla will continue to inspire new readings. And I think one way of looking at the frame tale can be in incorporating the experience of Shahrazad, who's a great storyteller, a great advisor to the king, with the broader theme of women and power in medieval culture. And I just happen to have the book here. This slide is from a forthcoming book from the Arab Literature for Youth series that is sponsored by the Library of Arabic Literature. And this one is an adaptation of a book that came out that actually Dr. Turawa and Julia Bray edited and translated. And so I think we can write more and think more of Shahrazad in the frame tale in that realm of women being close to power and historically, not just in literature. I hope that answers your question.
Two audience members are inquiring about the origin of the frame tale and the story within the story as a device.
The origin?
Yeah.
I think, I don't know that we know of one origin, but I think it's been shown. And just last week, there was a wonderful conference on framing in Berlin, hosted by the Kalila wa Dimna project. Again, another work that deals with the frames and framing. And what we realize is that it's hard to point to a culture that did not experiment with this form of stories within stories. But in the Arabic tradition, actually, it has more specific engagement. I mean, if you think of all forms of knowledge production, like if you think of hadith compilations and the isnad is a form of, keeping one hadith or one report through multiple contexts, and it carries the report over time and over different geographical areas. So it does that. If you think of any poetry compilation, the khabar, the metan and the isnad, this relationship is also comparable to the idea of a story within a story. But at a literary form, this dynamic of embedding and framing is pretty ubiquitous in all cultures.
There's a question for another one of your fellow editors. Lara asks, after thanking you for the talk, she asks, one, what do you make of the fact that the sin committed in the story, that is the killing the Afrit's son with a date pit, was in the first place an accident? Is it exactly commensurate with Shahrazad's position?
Yes, thank you, Lara, and thank you for being here and attending for the question. I think this story is playful in that there is hermeneutical humor to a certain extent. First, the act is random. It's an accident. And if you think of what happened in the frame tale, then there is a much more deliberate act. The act, the merchant doesn't see, like there's witnessing is alienated. So he's surprised. But also we see while in the frame tale, Shah Zaman witnesses his wife first cheating on him, and then he witnesses his brother's wife cheating, and a third time. So witnessing is prominent in the frame tale. But also the merchant has the opportunity to speak. He asks, "What did I do?" and is given an answer. And here I actually, in a more extended version of this talk, I show how the stages of what happens with the merchant kind of loosely kind of parody the legal process, right? So, and the three sheikhs kind of function as a witness experts. So it kind of directly contrasts with the idea that Shahriyar did that on his own, without consultation, and he misread the whole situation and didn't give a chance to his victims to speak.
Lara has another question, but I'm just going to mention, since a couple of people asked about the possibility of hearing or seeing a version of this. Some people had some issues with sound at the beginning. I think we resolved those problems, but it may have been on their end as well, because people were representing both that they could hear and that they couldn't. So one thing to note is that a recording of this talk will be available through the Library of Arabic Literature website, but also through the NYU Abu Dhabi website, and I believe it goes onto YouTube. Enass is also publishing this talk as an article in the Journal of Arabic and Islamic Studies, which is a freely accessible online journal. So you'll be able to see a more elaborate version of that. I'm not certain there'll be a transcript available, which is what some people have asked for, but you can go to the YouTube video. Lara's second question, I'll read it verbatim. I am convinced by your argument for reading Alf Layla as a work of adab. How then do we make sense of Ibn Nadim's dismissal of the work as mere entertainment?
I think the work changed. Like as I show in the fragment, there's no frame tale in the fragment. It starts Dina Zad asking her sister to speak. So it changed. The version we have now is certainly the version reconstructed by Mahdi is certainly not what Ibn Nadim had access to. And in the end, Ibn Nadim's Fihris is almost, we treat it like biblical source, but it is very important. But it's also an opinion, self-interested with the specific context of the time. So, but I think the version we're talking about now is much more elaborate and complex. And I think he would change his mind.
If I could just add, since I'm a Bible scholar, by which I mean an Ibn Nadim scholar, aspiring one, he also mentions in that same passage that Jashayari was collecting stories, and that it was supposed to be 1,000 nights, but it was only a certain number, and it's missing. And he doesn't make any disparaging comment about that act of collecting stories. So it's hard to know. Certainly, what Ibn Nadim saw, he didn't like. But he didn't have an animus against the concept of collecting stories. And that's introduced, as we know, by a discussion of Alexander and his courtiers and so on. So, but let me not speak. There are other people with questions, not articles. Morris asks, scholars like Mutahide have described a yearning for kinship that was distant from society and impartial to the interests of particular groups. Yet interestingly, the fantasy of the knights brings the rulers closer in a way to the people, especially stories in which Harun al-Rashid walks on the streets of Baghdad. What do you think this says about the audience for these tales? And let me just add that there's another question from an anonymous attendee that says some tales include real life people like Harun al-Rashid. I'm curious if the tales with real life people are true or merely fantasy. So these questions are two sides of more than two-sided coin.
I think the stories of Harun al-Rashid walking into the house of the three ladies belongs to fiction, not to reality. But yeah, it says a lot about the audience of Alf Layla, and I think it says a lot about why it survives in such great appeal over the years. Because in a way, first it's mocking the ruler and kind of taking away and alienating the idea that the ruler is a deputy of the prophet or of God. We're now in Mamluk times, perhaps it's also explains a little bit, but so it mocks the ruler and it gives more power to the moment of encounter of interpretation. And so in a way, it keeps meaning open. It keeps potential open. And that's why I said it's promissory. There is a sense of continuity in it that gives more power to readers. And I think that's the distinction also I make with advice literature, which is more geared to stabilizing meaning and stabilizing power and order. Alf Layla is more playful about that. And yes, the ruler actually, if you want to read it roughly, like Alf Layla is about bringing Shahriyar to his context and making him aware of the norms around him and the expectations around him.
Playfulness leads into the next question. One audience member asks about the amount of sexual content, which seems to be quite considerable. What was the reason behind that presence?
In the frame tale, for example, it brings, it connects actually the frame tale crisis is all kind of structured around sex scenes. And it continues in the stories of the sheikhs. There's a lot of sex also. So it becomes like a kind of a thread that connects everything in a very, again, playful and engaging way. And this is a tale, like I will speak about the sequences I spoke about today, where a king is killed, where a sage is beheaded, where, you know, the what is expected and what's allowed is pretty loose. So sex comes with that possibility, with that potential, you know. It makes clear that we're here in a realm that's experimental, that's fun, that doesn't abide by the rules. And it works. But it's not just this mere level of theme and scenes. It actually works into the hermeneutical humor that's in the text. So there are references, there are things that Alf Layla is expecting the readers to understand and know, and that's where the humor is, not in the scenes themselves.
One audience member asks if there's a way, or if the story of Sinbad has been traced to the ancient Egyptian story of the shipwrecked sailor.
Okay, so story of Sinbad has a very, very entangled history. And it's one of the stories that, although we have hadith Sinbad in somewhere around the text of the textual history of Alf Layla or Layla, but it's one that has a very complex genetic history. I'd be happy to refer you to more sources to read on that.
What is your opinion on the Western adaptation of the 1001 Night Stories and its themes of Orientalism?
The adaptation has not stopped. It's ongoing. And now actually with more, I'm very excited about the new translation that's coming out, with more scholars and readers and translators from, like in terms of scholarship, but also from within the tradition, bringing and highlighting more aspects of Alf Layla, I think the engagement would be different. But we're talking about a time when there was very limited access to what the work means, very limited access to the history of the manuscript. So it took on another life. And that's why I said it's more immediate when you talk about Alf Layla to expect it to be modern and Western. And we're actually putting an effort into bringing into it. It's, it's many layers from Arabo-Islamic culture. So it's an ongoing process, but I think the more work that's coming out from the scholarship and from translation, we will see different adaptations.
Well, there's more and more questions, so it's a good thing we have time. As long as you want to take a sip of water or something, Enass, before I
have a drink.
Okay, good. Okay, is there any suggestion in the analysis of the frame story of the day that marrying a serial murderer of women isn't a happy ending for Shahrazad, given especially that it is begetting him an heir that finally saves her life?
We don't know that that ending is actually the ending of the Nights. This is what's exciting about this work, because with every detail we can imagine a copyist or an author or a scholar, as Sharabi suggests, and Mahdi, adding something to it, right? I would suggest Shahrazad could have stopped with the end of the second sequence. But also an important point to make here is that, and I see it in the criticism of the Nights a lot, and I'm thinking of Shahrayar as a tyrant. I think the point to see here is that first, we had a stable kingdom. We had some form of legitimacy that's stable. And I show indications from the tale about that. So we are to understand Shahrayar was a good ruler. He was performing, according to expectation and keeping his kingdom stable and safe. And then he lost sight of justice and became murderous. And then he was restored to being a good king. So what's important here to know that we're not saying Shahriyar is good or bad. We're talking about performance. And this is an important point in Alf Layla. Rulership is a performance, and that's why it believes in reform. And instead of, taking the king out and replacing him. And what Shahrazad does brings to the readers, I believe, there is an encounter between Shahrazad and her father in the frame tale, the vizier, in which she tells him, I want to marry the king. And he says, why would you do that? It's crazy. You're going to end up killed. And she says, I have to do it. La budda min fa'lihi. And I think to the listeners, this is quite admirable, because there is the expectation that first, intention matters and niyyah matters, even if you don't succeed. Second, there is a concept in Islamic cultures called fard al-kifaya, in which when there is a crisis, when there is a need, one person can shoulder what the collective should be doing. So in a way, having the extreme Shahriyar doing this extreme, excessive, it's actually not punishment, it's just a murder spree of innocent women, is to contrast these elements. And that's how we should read it.
Since you mentioned listeners, I'm going to cut to Nasser Rabat's question. So I'm keeping you back. I knew you'd be happy to hear that. By the way, one person wants to know when you're coming back to Beirut. So many Arabic epics like Abi Zayd, Antara, and Zahir Baybars reached a wide audience through oral presentations by Hakawati. Do we know at all if Alf Layla was presented orally?
For sure, this is the predominant theory about Alf Layla, that it had a wide oral transmission. But I would say that what I see in my analysis, actually, I agree more with Mahdi and Sharabi and Malet, in that there is an intention and there is something happening through the copyists, the many authors, and the written transmission, because these are elaborate hermeneutical decisions that are being made. And actually, from the smallest details, you can tell that this is not an on-the-spot addition to the story, and it's someone thinking of how to, like in the story of King Yunan, how the book is called Khas al-Khawas, and how he's poisoned. There's something about kings who cannot read, or al-Kitab al-Masmum, the poisoned book, and mocking rulers who do not have enough knowledge. So there is very elaborate, I think, effort put into these tales and how they're compiled, that I'm more inclined to, yes, orally and through storytelling in different settings, that's accepted. But I would stress more that we think of the writers, the authors, and the copyists, and the effort they put into it.
So let me press you on this, and James Montgomery is as well. He says, who is the audience these features of the work you've outlined aimed at? So how does that relate to the answer about the Hakawati? So if it's the Hakawati in Hakawati contexts, then the audience is presumably one kind of audience. If it's advice literature, then presumably the audience is a slightly different I don't want to say courtly necessarily, but a slightly different audience. So what are your views on the intended audience for this kind of?
Yeah. So in the link I made with Adab, I want to answer that through that link, because, when we have in one argument made by an adib, 7 or 8 reports, all speaking of the same issue, different authorities, different level of report. One is lighter, one is kind of with a story that's kind of funny, one is more serious. I think it's the same with the stories that are embedded within these sequences, meaning as a narrator, you're selecting based on your audience, because in the second sequence with the fisherman and the Afrit, it's believed that 3 or 5 of the stories are added later. And what I think in these stories, we can imagine the narrator, if it's a more sophisticated audience, then you select the stories that are more elaborate. If it's an audience you want to keep interested, and then you go and skip into the lighter and shorter stories. And you would see that in the sequences there are I call them silent stories. For example, the Afrit says, "Please don't do to me what Atika did to her sister." And then the fisherman would ask, "What did she do?" And he would say, "I'm in such an uncomfortable position right now in this bottle, I cannot narrate it." But you can see that for a narrator, maybe a storyteller, this is an opportunity to come up with something in response to the immediate audience. But again, I would go back to my first point that we need to think more of a more well-read audience, and even bookish readers, people who are reading it and not just listening to it, because of all these elaborate hermeneutical plays in the text.
A much more granular question now, or focused. The story circa the 438th night, wherein a woman was challenged by all the greatest Islamic scholars and defeated them, as well as scholars in other areas. When a scholar lost, he had to give up all his clothes. It has quite a bit of humor as well as religious analysis. What is your opinion of that?
I think this is something, I think what is charming about studying, for example, justice and sex scenes in one breath, is that, again, this is a text that wants to be read, and it's playful and at the same time very complex. And through these smaller details of the narrative, we are allowed, and we should, I think, reconstruct serious questions that are being presented. So there is so much that can be read in that scene, right? Especially thinking of what's expected, what the image of the scholar is, what the image of a debate outcome is expected to be. So by reversing all that and stripping it naked, literally, then you're kind of making an argument, but in a playful, a literary narrative way.
One of the interesting stories for that kind of thinking as well is the story of the Hunchback, right? Mm-hmm. Where justice on display, you've got appearances deceive people, you've got characters from different communities. I mean, there seems to be an attempt to bring in all kinds of aspects of the way that one might operate a justice system, either successfully or unsuccessfully, which dovetails with a question here about, in fact, where people are from. Someone asks, in the original story, Aladdin was written as a boy from a city in China, but named Aladdin. And from the point of view of the reader, the imagery feels like it is set in Arabia or Persia. Is this because the author wanted to add mystery and intrigue, or is there some other reason for this setting?
I wonder if here we have Johannes, if he's attending this talk. I cannot tell. I would think both, and I think for not just in Alf Layla Layla, but in medieval Arab works, we often see references to the king of China, a king in India, the Sasanian king, and then they name them Alexander the Great. So you have geographies of cultural references, but they change. They're not the same. And they move in certain ways in every tale, like they do in other forms of knowledge production. And you move them to, in a way, this cultural geography confirms a specific argument you're making in these texts. So for the stories in Alf Layla Layla, also these geographies move to make a point. And I think, for example, the story of Shahrayar, Malik Sin Sin and Hind and Samarkand, it's taken it out of the immediate Islamic context. It's telling us this is not a caliph, relax. It's going to do something horrible and there will be kings that die, but relax, this is, and also, of course, the intrigue and the curiosity. But we have to know that this is not unusual. Readers of medieval texts are familiar with all these references to Greek, Sasanian, Indian, even Chinese cultures in variety of contexts.
One person has a follow-up question on the preceding one about audience. Is it similarly possible to theorize about the gender of the audience? Were the stories listened to by men and women alike?
That's a very interesting question. I'll have to think about that, but it's really a brilliant question. I would think it would be hugely amusing for both, and for different reasons. But also, everyone is being made fun of in these stories. So you have two women turned into a she-mule and a gazelle. And then you have two men turned into two black dogs. So the humor, there's enough to go around. But this is an interesting question to think about. Thank you.
One of the things that I noticed, when you read Hadawi's introduction, he says he heard these stories from his grandmother. And there are any number of people, of authors, who either reworked the nights or translated the nights, who mentioned that they heard it from their mother or their grandmother. And so whatever the original audience might have been, it is the case in its later iterations that some people anyway, men, are receiving the stories from women. And of course, that immediately reminds one that one of the things we forget is that if you accept the story is always being told by a woman. But whatever the case is, Shahrazad's voice is the voice that's supposed to be telling all of this. So, you're not going to believe this, but you have a question from Philip Kennedy. I'll read the whole thing. Thank you, Enass. Wonderful lecture. Would you agree that the earlier redactors of the Nights understood your scheme of reading, but didn't later redactors lose sight of this when they added a whole bundle of diverse materials? And then in parentheses, how much of the Nights collection works with your reading, approximately?
What's the last part?
I think he's trying to work out whether we're talking about the same Nights, right? So you've got a scheme at work, but then with all the accretion and the bundling and things that come later, would your reading still hold?
I think, I made a specific decision to talk about these 3 sets of stories because when I thought that everyone assumed that these 3 are one set. I remember mentioning that to Aliyat Kolla, who was teaching a class on Alf Layla, and he said, you should write that because no one says that. And I was like, but it's so clear that they have a complete conversation. And that doesn't mean that these themes do not recur in later tales and that they are not gesturing back to this debate. And I think it's near impossible to contain the many chains within the Nights in any theme or a number of themes. It's very diverse. But I think this set alone made sense to not one person, but several generations of copyists that they kept it intact, maybe added, like I said, the second sequence of the fisherman and the Afrit. We believe there are many stories added to it. They don't change the tone or the message. Some of them do not add anything, actually. They're just, there. But they did make one debate. That's why I believe it made sense to someone, not just one person, because it was kept there and then added other things. And I feel like, why not, like an adab work, again, you have the general theme, but then within it, you don't have one argument or two. You have just everything that the author felt could fall under this theme and inform it in a way. And it brings me back to the idea of readers, actual readers of the text, in that there is always the option of choosing. And I see that clearly in Alf Layla wa Layla. You're selecting from these sets of stories, like what you said, Tilawa, about people hearing from their grandmothers. You're selecting what you want to say to someone else, or you want to narrate, or what context you want to use. And this variety is there for you to choose. But yeah, I see that conversation in the first three stories alone.
One person asks, for a person just starting out, reading Alf Layla, can you suggest resources that give a sort of overview of themes and things to as we read on? Do you have any specific, are there any specific works of scholarship or websites or anything that you would recommend to someone? I don't know if this person, judging from the name, the person probably reads Arabic, so, but Arabic or Arabic resources?
What's the first part of the question? I'm sorry.
Someone who's starting out reading Alf Layla.
Yes.
Resources are available to the person.
In Arabic and English?
To learn more about the themes.
The themes. Yeah. I think the encyclopedia is a great source. I would say to look at to wait for Yasmin's translation. By the way, she will be the first woman translating the Nights, so that would be wonderful. And in terms of books, I think the person I mentioned, Ibrahim Akel, he writes in Arabic too, and gives an overview of the Nights. But yeah, I cannot think of one word. Please do leave your email, and I will send you a bibliography of suggestions. Yeah.
I'm just putting the names of the editors of the encyclopedia.
Thank you.
In the chat. What is it called? The Encyclopedia of the Arabian Nights, something like that. And you mentioned Ibrahim. Is it Ibrahim Akel?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is he also the? Yes, that's right. I
think there is a book that came out this year, edited by him. Yeah.
Yes, and Yasmin Seal, whose translation of Aladdin has already appeared with Norton, and who's working on translation of The Whole Nights, and with whom you opened, right, with that opening slide of the work that she's doing.
Yes. I asked her to start with her work because she thinks of the night in a very innovative and artistic way, and I thought it's pretty brilliant that as a woman she'll be translating it. I'm sure it will be a great edition. I had the pleasure of hearing her speak at Yale, and it was a luminous talk and translation, the parts of which she read. Here's a good question. They're all good questions, of course, but this is a fun one. This question is for both Ms. Khansa and Mr. Turawa. Which tales are you most fond of and why? I defer to you. حمال والثلاث بنات.
حمال والثلاث بنات. Okay, so The Porter and the Three Ladies, a very famous story. Probably one of the ones that's most studied.
Yeah, so it's very long. It's beautiful, and it has a lot on Baghdad, and it's very witty and very entertaining. I love all the word games they play, and it has everything basically. And then you have Harun al-Rashid, and the scope of imagination is just astounding in this tale. What's yours, Turawa?
Well, since I was asked, I feel like I should answer. So mine is actually the frame tale. One of the things I say to my students, this goes a little bit against what you were saying about whether the ending is was. To me, what makes Arabian Nights is the presence of the frame at the beginning and the end. And there are very few iterations that don't have Shahrazad. She seems to be the glue. And even though I agree with everything you said, I do think that there's a way in which it's not the Arabian Nights, it's not Alf Layla if there's no Shahrazad, and that requires the frame to open and to conclude in whatever way it concludes. I'm not attached to that conclusion, and I do think he's a serial murderer and rapist. But there is a way in which that provides a certain I'm not going to call it coherence, but frame, literally frame to the whole thing. So that's my favorite in that sense, not favorite in terms of the story itself. The Port of the Three Ladies and many others for that matter. I just want to say that one person has asked for whether his question was visible earlier. I guess we both missed it, but it's about someone who's writing a novel and wants advice on resources. So I think that will be captured by our answers about things like the encyclopedia and others as a good place to go. It is one of the most heavily adapted works, and I can recommend the Wikipedia entry, actually, if you want to look at the ways in which it's been adapted, because whoever's been working on that entry has been creating a kind of inventory and repertory of all the works in world literature that have turned to the Knights. Philip Kennedy suggests Robert Irwin's Companion as well, which is also a very good suggestion, yes. I mean, there's a lot. Now, Johannes has answered. So because you took him by name,
Yeah.
As a comment to the previous question, as Enass has referred to me, Aladdin is a late addition to the corpus. Joseph Sadan has found some parallels to A Tale from Ottoman Times. According to Jean-Paul Sermin, the later added orphan stories to which Aladdin belongs portray a very different type of story, in which Todorov's sort of mechanical view on characters as narrative functions, which is why they die so often, doesn't seem as central as is the case in older tales. Aladdin seems a more personalized, emotionally complex tale, reminiscent of a coming-of-age fairy tale. It doesn't seem to have much to do with the negotiation of justice, as in the older bundle of stories, the fisherman, the trader, the hunchback, the porter, and the ladies that Enass has presented so concisely. And speaking of Enass's concise presentation, after you respond to this, I'm going to bring this to a close as we're approaching 11 o'clock.
I wanted to mention that Johannes is doing an edition for Lal about Hanna Diab, the person who's believed to be one source of the tales. So you can add that to your list of sources to look forward to. It's forthcoming. Thank you so much, Dr. Turawa. Thank you, everyone, for attending this and for listening. Lal, it's a pleasure to be part of this family, and I look forward to a very productive tenure. It's a joy to share my passion and to talk about my work. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been very special.
And I'd like to just add to those thanks. Thank you, Enass, for a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry for those of you who had difficulties with sound. I hope that was able to be resolved. You'll be able to go to the YouTube recording of this, and I believe we'll post it on a link to it on our Library of Arabic Literature website as well. I just want to acknowledge again NYU Abu Dhabi, the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, for the purposes of this lecture, notably Nahed Ahmed, who helped put this all together, and her team of technical and other administrative staff. The Library of Arabic Literature would not be anywhere without the support of NYU Abu Dhabi and the generosity and vision of Tamkeen. And so we, on behalf of Philip Kennedy and the entire library and its editors and the entire production team and others, we would also like to express publicly our thanks to the institutions for the support, and we look forward to continuing to produce interesting books and bringing you exciting lectures. There's an Instagram page, there's a Facebook page, we're on Twitter, there's a website. A lot of our materials are free. I mentioned that the Arabic texts that are edited for the library are all freely available for download, and our books are cheap, affordable, again, thanks to the grant. So thank you for supporting our speakers and our publications, and I look forward to seeing everyone 1 year from today. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.